Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the global launch of the 15th Singapore International Energy Week, or SIEW SIEW. My name is Regina Lee, your host from the Energy Market Authority of Singapore. To begin today's program, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Ngiam Shih Chun, Chief Executive of the Energy Market Authority, on stage to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Ngiam, please.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome and a good afternoon to everyone. It is a great pleasure to meet everyone in person once again. The last few years have been very trying for many of us, and we've been trying to hold physical events and hybrid events, but it is certainly a refreshing change to have everyone present in person again, interacting freely outside and within the room as well. And this bodes well for Singapore International Energy Week. And I really look forward to all the active discussions that we're going to have today, as well as for the rest of the year. Now, last year, SIEW was held in a hybrid format. More than 4,000 people joined us on site, and more than 20,000 joined us online. This year, we look forward to meeting everyone to celebrate SIEW's 15th anniversary. Now, following from COP26, many countries are in the process or have already enhanced many of their carbon mitigation plans and commitments. Singapore is no different. We increased our carbon mitigation pledge to reach net zero by or around mid-century. And Singapore is fully committed to this journey, and will be certainly investing and putting in place a whole host of measures and programs to ensure that we achieve our climate mitigation pledges. Now, earlier this year, EMA commissioned or released a report, the Energy 2050 Committee report, which indicated that it is technically feasible for Singapore's power sector to achieve net zero by 2050. And certainly this is a real milestone for us, because it shows that it is possible if we work together and implement innovative solutions with various from the academia, from R&D, and companies to work together to achieve a net zero future. But as the report highlighted, this will be a challenging journey due to uncertainties with the geopolitical trends, with technological developments. The ongoing energy crisis has emphasized the importance of energy security and resilient energy systems. The volatility in global energy markets has tested the faith that some have in energy markets and systems. But now more than ever, we have to press on with our decarbonization journey. The power sector alone and the energy sector contributes a significant portion of carbon emissions around the world, and it is imperative that we work together to address this global challenge. I am therefore delighted to share this year's theme, a resilient and sustainable energy future. At SIEW 2022, we explore how we can ensure a secure, sustainable, diverse, resilient, low-carbon energy system as the world undergoes a profound change in the way we produce, transport, and use energy. Now, according to the International Energy Agency, or IEA, the definition of energy security is becoming broader and more dynamic as compared to the past. The dimensions now include emerging risks as energy systems become more digitalized, electrified, and diversified. For example, while digitalization creates many opportunities, which can accelerate the growth of clean energy and the integration of renewables, it does bring increased risk of cyber attacks and certain imbalances that we might face within the energy systems. We also need to enhance the role of green financing and innovation in building our low-carbon energy future. Now, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, an annual investment of US $5.7 trillion will be needed every year until 2030 to raise the proportion of renewables in our energy mix globally from 14% to 40%. It's therefore important for countries to develop and deploy a portfolio of bankable, low-carbon generation sources to diversify power supply and to hedge against energy security risks. It's against this backdrop that SIEW will mark its 15th anniversary. This significant milestone would not have been possible without your strong support and participation. For the first time, Singapore and the IEA will co-host the inaugural Singapore IEA Ministerial Roundtable, Energy Security in a Low-Carbon World. The roundtable will bring together energy ministers and industry leaders to address the interlinkages on energy security and energy transitions in a dynamic and complex energy landscape. We'll also be partnering IRENA to hold the second Singapore IRENA High-Level Forum. The forum will focus on the role of green financing and investments into end-user decarbonization technologies for clean energy transition. To commemorate SIEW's 15th anniversary, we'll be launching a new podcast series. We're calling it SIEWcast, and it will feature high-level interviews with top energy leaders. We'll also be introducing SIEW Tech Tables, where international organizations and think tanks will host discussions on the latest energy innovations and technologies. Another key highlight will be the 15th anniversary event, which will be held on the first day of SIEW. This year, you can also look forward to exhibitions and networking receptions as we welcome more of you to join us in person. SIEW will continue to feature our returning partner events that will address key topics such as renewable and clean energy, sustainability in refining and petrochemicals, grid optimization, and the growth and development of LNG and hydrogen. Together, the SIEW Energy Insights and SIEW Think Tank Roundtables will showcase perspectives from international organizations and industry leaders to address how we can advance the energy transition. To kickstart the SIEW discussions this year, I would like to thank our speakers from IEA, IRENA, Sembcorp, Siemens, and SMBC for sharing their perspectives. I look forward to meeting all of you in person in October this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ngiam. Next, we have a special message from Dr. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today for the global launch of Singapore International Energy Week 2022. Let me start by congratulating our friends, our good friends at Energy Market Authority for this, the 15th anniversary of the SIEW coming up later this year. The extraordinary developments of the last 2 months have changed the world, as such, the energy world. And it has given policymakers an even more complicated, more complex range of challenges to confront. Our world has been reminded once again that the pathway to a more secure and sustainable energy system might not be smooth. And all the regions around the world will be affected, and Southeast Asia is not an exception. To make the transition to clean energy as quickly and as effective as possible, international dialogue and cooperation will be crucial. That is why the International Energy Agency is very pleased to be part of this year's SIEW once again, as we believe it provides a unique forum to bring all the key players together to forge real-world solutions and actions. It is also why I am very pleased that during SIEW, the IEA will be co-hosting with Singapore a ministerial roundtable. This builds on the excellent discussions I had with Minister Tan See Ling at the recent IEA Ministerial. We had a very good and productive discussion. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, today there is no question that the Southeast Asia plays a more important role than ever before on the wider global energy questions. With its importance in mind, we have provided a fully fledged regional energy outlook every 2 years. And I am pleased to say that the latest version of the Southeast Asia Outlook was released yesterday, a wonderful guidebook for policymakers, whoever is interested in the region for important decisions to take. Our chief economist, Mr. Tim Gould, will present the key findings of this year's outlook later in the program. As you will see, the energy developments in the region are quite momentous, and the decisions we will make in the region will have far-reaching consequences for the economy, for the citizens, for the industry, and beyond. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a successful event today.
Thank you, Dr. Birol. Now, we would like to invite Dr. Binu Patan, Head of Regions, International Renewable Energy Agency, on stage to deliver his presentation on the World Energy Transition Outlook. Dr. Patan, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's great to be back to physical events. And it's been several months since we started traveling, and we're very pleased that SIEW is the global launch of SIEW is where we are starting to travel for the very first time. I also noticed when CEO Shih Chun was talking that IRENA is probably younger than SIEW. So we've been around only for about 12 years. And that also, in a sense, exemplifies how renewable energy has evolved over the last 10, 12 years, from being a very small option to the mainstream of energy transition. And what that has contributed is really that the IRENA membership, which was in a few tens of countries, have slowly increased to cover about 184 countries, which account for about 98% of the global energy demand. And what we saw in Glasgow was that all the countries have included renewable energy as the most important mitigation option for their climate commitments. And this is also something which is not just happening because of the way the politics has evolved, but the economics and the technology and the learning curves has also contributed to this. So this is really very much a story about renewable energy driving energy transition. Those of you who do not know of IRENA, we're headquartered in Abu Dhabi with offices in New York and Bonn, and where we do look at different aspects of the energy transition. So I wanted to share some perspectives from the World Energy Transition Outlook. We launched this last month with Germany in Berlin, Germany, which holds the G7 presidency this year. And this is probably one of the other instances where we want to share some more perspectives with the larger audience. So one thing we'd like to confirm here is that we believe that energy transition in a manner that is consistent with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement is indeed possible. And that's going to bring about a lot more positive benefits to the economies, jobs, etc. But again, as Dr. Birol mentioned, this is something which needs to be done in a very careful and a calibrated manner. We see several technological avenues which are going to drive this energy transition. And of course, the key one is going to be renewables. But very importantly, an important dimension of this energy transition is going to be electrification. So we are moving from a very much mechanical device-driven energy system to something which will be driven more by electricity at the end-use sector. And over the next 10, 20, 30 years or so, this electrification of end users, transport, buildings, industry, is going to be a key defining theme. And that will have a lot of opportunities and also possible challenges. We will also have an important role for energy efficiency. And increasingly, and this has been something which a lot of member countries have been reaching out to us for advice, is the role of green hydrogen going forward. So if we were to pick 2 or 3 key technologies which will drive this energy transition, it's going to be electrification, energy efficiency, and green hydrogen. And with that electricity, 90% of that coming from renewable energy. What is also happening at the same time is the phase out of some of these power options, starting with coal. As you know, the global usage of coal peaked around 2013-14, and we are now, with the Glasgow Climate Pact, into the territory of phasing out or phasing down coal, and that will also have important implications in the way the energy transition is happening. What will also be aiding this energy transition is the tremendous reductions that we are seeing in the cost of power, levelized cost of energy from power options such as solar and wind. Now, what you see here is IRENA's own database from our member states, and these are not models. So these are based on 20,000 actual projects and PPAs, which have been entered by governments and utilities with renewable energy companies, but also a database on auctions. So some of these will actually come on board in the next 1 or 2 years, or 1 or 2, 3 years or so. So what we are seeing is that as far as power generation is concerned, renewables is the least cost option without any environmental, social externalities. And this is something that we are seeing on a year-by-year basis. For the last 6 years or so, we have seen that renewable energy has been overtaking the conventional power sources by a factor of 6 or 7 or so. And that is something which we expect to happen and accelerate over the coming years. As I did mention, there's a lot of interest about hydrogen. And this is where we'd like to encourage countries in this region and beyond to look at it with some caution, because we see that a lot of countries are believing that hydrogen could actually be produced in country A and be transported around the world. And we do believe that wherever there is a possibility to electrify, electrification would be the immediate option. And there are certain sectors which are going to be difficult to decarbonize, let's say shipping, that is navigation, aviation, and some heavy industries where hydrogen will be required. And here again, we believe that a lot of that hydrogen will come from the country itself or the region rather than intercontinental transfer of hydrogen. There may still be some opportunities. For example, as was alluded to by Dr. Birol, Europe is facing an energy security issue, and we've been facilitating some dialogue with regions around Europe, say the Middle East and Africa, about the possibility of these regions to offer hydrogen to Europe. But again, there are certain requirements for Europe which need to be met, particularly the color of hydrogen, the standards, etc. But then the key point that we wanted to make is that hydrogen is going to be an important option, but again, the trade flows on hydrogen may not be that big as one would expect it to be, but it will remain as an important component of energy transition, particularly for Europe and several other regions as well. This is another, the trend that we see. So you will see that the role of hydrogen is quite important, but not so much in the global context. And maybe it's a bit too small for your, what you can see. There are a number of countries which already have hydrogen strategies, and that number is growing. We are supporting, in a traditional way, IRENA has supported more developing countries with their energy transition strategies on technologies. And where we find is that both the OECD and non-OECD countries are being supported by IRENA on the energy roadmap. So, the hydrogen roadmap. So this is something which is also a new phenomena that we see. Here again, this is what I alluded to in the beginning. A lot of countries do look at energy transition with a bit of a skepticism as to how it's going to affect the GDP growth, etc. And our socioeconomic modeling shows that there's going to be a 1.4% increase in global GDP as a result of energy transition. There will be some regional adjustments, but again, if you look at a longer term, up to 2050 or so, the benefits are largely positive. But then to essentially gain from those benefits, countries will have to make structural adjustments in terms of their energy sector and other economic sectors, so that the overall benefit there is largely positive. And you will also find that we expect to see some reduction in terms of and phase out in terms of fossil fuel powered generation as well. Another important aspect is the jobs. So there is a concern that a number of jobs in existing fossil fuel supply chains will be lost. But what we see is that the gains in jobs are actually more in terms of renewable energy compared to the losses in terms of the fossil fuel supply chains. And what you see is an excerpt from the IRENA jobs report, where you find that even during last year, during the pandemic, where number of jobs were lost, renewable energy jobs increased by 500,000 globally. And we see that the job growth is actually in solar energy mostly. And these are jobs which are in the countries where you use energy, not so much in the countries which produce energy sources. So these are local jobs. And another dimension is also that we find, and it must be obvious, that there is probably a significant increase of women who can be employed in renewable energy jobs compared to the traditional energy option. So it also brings in that equity aspect, which is important for a number of governments and regions. These are, again, some of the scenarios that we have presented. And again, what we believe that the socioeconomic transition is largely going to be positive, but there could also be factors which will affect that transition. So one could be the carbon pricing in a global or a region level, but also how some countries, particularly in developing parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, would need development support to develop their energy system towards energy transition. So how much those transfers do happen will also depend on the pace and the rate of energy transition. Another aspect is the just transition. So obviously, when you go from, particularly in some regions, when you go from liquid fossil fuel driven economies to electricity driven economies, there needs to be structural adjustments. So there needs to be new skills which are required for the new jobs which will be there, which will be more number of jobs. And also the whole system of education, the economy, etc., will need to be adjusted. So IRENA has developed a just transition framework and also working with a number of countries to move forward with the just transition and energy transition as well. So the final slide where I'll stop is also, one is IRENA's role in doing this analytical at the global level. And what we are also going to do is that we are going to bring it down to the region level, and one of which will start in Southeast Asia, which we will launch with the Indonesian G20 presidency sometime back later this year. But we will also extend it to other regions. We've already looked at Central America. We're looking at South America. We're going to look at how Europe is going to do this energy transition and work with the European countries to do that. We'll also extend that to Africa in about 5 sub-regions. But beyond all of that, how do individual countries implement these perspectives at the ground level? And this is really where we have now increasingly working at the country level. So we've worked in about 84 countries, where we have looked at the climate commitments that countries are making and then deploying IRENA expertise at the country level, working with the energy and the climate ministries to make sure that this transition is actually on a strong footing. In some cases, it's more about planning. In some cases, about data and statistics. A lot of cases, it's about flexibility of energy systems. So we are deploying that, and this is something which will continue. So what we want to do going forward is really providing the global direction in terms of energy transition, identifying the pathways, but also looking at the socioeconomic transition which is required, and then work at the region level and at the country level to make sure that this energy transition moves forward. So we hope to present some glimpses of this at SIEW later this year. And once again, we are very grateful for the partnership that we have with the Energy Markets Authority and the Singapore government. And we look forward to sharing more expertise in October with a larger audience on what IRENA is doing and some of the results of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pathan. Let us now invite Mr. Tim Goh, Chief Energy Economist of the International Energy Agency, to deliver his presentation on the Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2022. Mr. Goh, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to join you today. Thanks and congratulations to SIEW for this opportunity and for your global launch. As you mentioned, what I'm going to do today is complement these more global reflections that we just heard from my colleague from IRENA with some regional specific remarks based on our new Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2022 that was published yesterday. And on the next slide, there's a few elements of context here that I would like to highlight. We do have a long-standing partnership with Southeast Asia. We were delighted to see high-level partners from across the region at our recent IEA ministerial meeting in Paris. And many of the themes from that ministerial discussion are also the themes that I'd like to pick up today. So affordability, sustainability, energy security, especially at this time of volatility associated with the energy crisis that's been caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as we heard in those introductory remarks, high and volatile fuel prices, they are a major challenge for many economies, including those in Southeast Asia. And they remind us of why we need to invest in cleaner and more efficient technologies. But they also highlight the risks, particularly from vulnerable sectors of the population from higher fuel prices. But as the chief executive said in his opening remarks, we do have to press on. And that's something that is very visible when you look at the policy commitments that are now being made by countries across Southeast Asia. Those net zero ambitions that are now such an important part of the overall framing for the energy future in this region. So the ambitions are becoming increasingly clear. But the question we also have to ask is, are the policies in place that will deliver on those ambitions? And that's in many ways, that's the key question which we try and investigate in our new outlook. And we have two scenarios that reflect a little bit that duality. The first is based on our reading of all of the policies that are actually in place or that have really been announced in many parts of the region. And that's what we call the stated policy scenario. And that doesn't assume automatically that longer term aspirational targets are met. And the second scenario, it's called the sustainable development scenario. And that's a pathway towards achieving the goals that many countries across Southeast Asia have set for themselves. And that's a trajectory compatible with the Paris Agreement. Of course, many of those long-term net zero or carbon neutrality goals, they have recently been announced. So it's not reasonable to assume that all of the building blocks that will be needed to get to those long-term goals are already in place. But that gap between those two trajectories is being filled, and that's an incredibly positive note on which to start my presentation. But on my next slide, I'd like to just look back a little bit at where we've come from. And we just need to have in mind how important a region Southeast Asia is, both for the global economy and for global energy trends. Energy demand has doubled, or almost doubled, over the last 20 years. There's significant country by country variations. But we have to have in mind 90% of that growth in energy demand over the last 20 years has been met by increased use of fossil fuels. And you can see that across different sectors, from industry to transport, and to a degree also in buildings. So we haven't yet reached that turning point. And if you look to the power sector, as has been mentioned already, the power sector is really the sector you should expect to see movement first, because there are so many cost-effective technologies there to move away from polluting power generation. But for every dollar that was invested in renewable power in Southeast Asia in recent years, another dollar was invested in unabated fossil fuel generation. And there's quite uneven patterns of investment across the region as well. So there is, of course, work to be done. And if you look ahead to how that plays out in the future on the next slide, you can see that in our stated policy scenario, there is a strong degree of continuity in the future when you consider previous trends. So fossil fuels still account for around 3/4 of the increase in demand over the next 10 years to 2030. That's lower than what we've seen in the last 20 years. And the reason for that is, if we move on with one click, is because renewables are growing strongly in this region. But that share of fossil fuels in meeting future demand is still relatively high. And if governments across the region pursue policies that hit their climate goals, as in the Sustainable Development Scenario, then this picture will need to change. And if we move on to the next image on this slide, you can see the difference in outlook that would be required in order to meet those goals. So just a couple of examples on oil demand in a Sustainable Development Scenario. Already by 2030, sales of electric vehicles would need to outpace the sales of conventional cars. So you push up that share of electric mobility in the system, and you can see the effect that that and other measures would have on oil demand. And likewise, you need to find ways to substitute out the energy services that are currently provided by unabated coal, not just in the power sector, but also in some key industrial areas like cement and iron and steel. And that's about that rapid scale up of renewables that our colleague from IRENA mentioned, but it's also some other technologies that need to be part of the conversation, including demand side measures, low carbon fuels, and efforts to curb emissions via carbon capture, utilization, and storage in some cases. On the next slide, I'd like to highlight that the risks to energy security that we see today, they do not go away in that stated policy scenario. You can see on the screen that the region's net oil import requirements in a stated policy scenario only grows over the next decades. And that's because domestic consumption continues to rise. The region's upstream output doesn't keep pace. So oil imports more than double by mid-century in that scenario, implying even greater strains on consumers and economies from high and potentially volatile prices. And within a few years, we also have to have in mind that Southeast Asia may well become a large importer of natural gas. So accelerating clean energy transitions is a key way to reduce these energy security vulnerabilities. So you have a significant reduction in that import requirement if you move to a sustainable development scenario. And a similar set of risks and solutions is visible on the next slide if you look at emissions, because today's pathway is associated with a continued rise in energy-related CO2 emissions, and that could exacerbate some risks also to air quality and the vulnerabilities that the region is facing from a changing climate. And one of the reasons you have air quality risks is also because in this kind of scenario, if we move on to the next click, then you still have a large share of the population in some countries, notably in Laos, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, relying on the traditional use of solid biomass as a cooking fuel. And I think there are wider risks at a moment when fossil fuel prices are high, and that even more people may be pushed back in towards reliance on traditional and polluting fuels. So we recognize that the region is making huge progress on access to electricity, but we do see some risks in the near term also with regard to access to affordable and clean cooking fuels. So there is a range of energy security and sustainability issues that need to be resolved. And in my final 4 slides, I'd like to just look at 4 deep dive areas that we focused on in our new outlook. So examining what it would take to move the region onto a different pathway. And the first is about electricity. And you can see immediately from the slide the importance that electricity, that clean electricity, needs to have in the future for Southeast Asia. And that necessarily also means a diminishing role for unabated fossil fuel generation. And we can click through and see how that role fades over time. And that transformation of the supply side, if we have a final click here, you can see the influx of clean technologies, wind and solar, and a range of other low emissions generation options. And that would move the region's power sector towards that low emissions future. And we're all aware that the challenge that you would face in such a scenario is to maintain electricity security. You have a very, very large increase in the need for flexibility. As we've explained in other parts of our analysis and in previous outlooks, there are different components to that flexibility debate, and notably the importance of a well-integrated regional power grid. But this time we wanted to focus on another aspect, and that's the possibilities for existing coal and gas-fired plants to change their roles within the power system. So at the moment, you can see the data at the start of this time series, how essentially the coal and gas-fired plants today, they are the main sources of generation. But during transitions, they could also be quite a cost-effective way to provide flexibility by adjusting their output to the needs of the system. However, our analysis also shows that existing contractual arrangements are a barrier to this kind of change of roles that is required. Many of the existing PPAs specify a minimum daily load for these plants. In Thailand, for example, we found that minimum take capacity in all contracts decreases by only 10% to 2030. So we need some changes to these structures. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to repurpose these assets to offer flexibility. And moreover, at a time when we have very high fossil fuel prices, these current arrangements risk locking in expensive sources of generation and the associated emissions, and putting up barriers to the expansion of cost-effective renewable generation. And this is an area that we believe needs a serious look. On the next slide, I wanted to highlight not just the importance of clean electricity, but also the role that clean fuels can make to Southeast Asia. You will need clean fuels in future. Some of those will be produced, we hope, with clean electricity, but even so, there is a significant component of the future that may not be met in all cases by direct or indirect electricity. So in some countries, there's a window for gas to play a bigger role in transitions, especially where it displaces more polluting fuels. But of course, that debate has been complicated by today's price environment. So we wanted to zoom in on some other possibilities, such as modern biofuels, hydrogen, ammonia, and synthetic fuels. Southeast Asia already has a very large biofuel sector, and this has brought with it, of course, some debates about the trade-offs involved, particularly at a time of high food prices. So in our analysis, we wanted to highlight the importance of the region's transitions to very sustainable feedstocks, such as agricultural residues or municipal waste that can be used for energy with minimal adverse effects on land use or biodiversity. And I think over the long term, I'd echo some of the thoughts from the previous presentation. There is potential for hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels, including the possibility to co-fire existing thermal power plants with ammonia. And we're very pleased to see how Singapore is amongst the front runners in laying out hydrogen pathways for the future and supporting some pilot projects. And I think it is also encouraging to see in recent years some of the moves that have been made to tap into the region's CO2 storage potential, with at least 7 large-scale CCUS projects in various stages of planning. But none of this will be possible, if we move on to the next slide, unless we have that surge of investment in clean energy technologies. And you can see on the screen here the size of this challenge. Even to keep pace with the region's stated policies, you'd need a doubling in overall energy investment by 2030. And to get on track for Southeast Asia's climate ambitions, the flows of capital to the energy sector would need to almost triple. And of course, these investment requirements come at a difficult moment for the regional and global economy, with near-term uncertainties over growth and business confidence. So in our analysis, we highlight a few important points that I'd like to draw your attention to now. Of course, we're all aware, and we saw in the previous presentation, how wind and solar PV have experienced major cost reductions over the last decade. But costs in some parts of Southeast Asia remain relatively high, and that's related to sometimes unclear or slow-moving policies and regulations, which have hampered long-term predictability for investors. Another aspect of this is, where does the money come from? And around half of the energy investment in Southeast Asia in recent years has relied on public sources of finance, including both publicly owned financial organizations and state-owned enterprises. But if we are going to see a rapid clean energy transition, we're going to have to also scale up private sector finance, and that's been crucial in many ways for the rapid rollout of renewable projects in Vietnam and Thailand in recent years. We're also going to have to deal with issues around the financial sustainability of major energy players, notably utilities. That remains a bottleneck for investment, as they are off-takers for key projects, and the economic consequences of the pandemic have increased the strains in many cases. And I think finally, there is a big role there for international development finance, which has to be used more effectively to catalyze private investment, especially in nascent cleaner energy sectors and riskier countries. And I note in this respect, we heard some great examples of innovative thinking in this area from Minister Tan when he came to our IA ministerial a few weeks ago. But I think there's still more to be done in that area. My final slide is really inviting us to focus on one of the huge opportunities that lie ahead for countries that are ready to make the move into the new global energy economy. There are many aspects to this, but I wanted to focus on Southeast Asia's potential as a supplier of critical minerals, which could reinforce the region's position on a host of clean energy supply chains. Already today, we see Malaysia, we see Vietnam, big producers of solar PV modules, but Indonesia and the Philippines are also, I mean, they're the two largest nickel producers in the world. And nickel, of course, one of the major inputs to batteries. And what we wanted to highlight on this slide is that this could be a major source of revenue, but there are some warning signs. And in our analysis, we look at how investment in mineral exploration in Southeast Asia has declined in recent years. So the region's share in the global mineral exploration budget has halved since 2012. And that kind of trend needs to be reversed if Southeast Asia is to realize its potential in this growing sector. So there are real potential opportunities there for the region, but there's also the need to strengthen Southeast Asia's position in some of these value chains through the sustainable development of its mining activities, including close attention to ESG requirements. So I will end on a hopeful note. Of course, transitions are all about reducing emissions, but they're also, let's remember, about the opportunities that clean energy economy offers for growth, for employment, and particularly for a fast-growing region such as Southeast Asia. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Goh. Please remain online as we move into the panel discussion. Let us now invite our panelists on stage. Dr. Binu Partham, Head of Regions, International Renewable Energy Agency, Mr. Samuel Moriong, Senior Vice President, Asia Pacific, Siemens Energy, and Mr. Vikram Vijayan, Head of Energy Commercial, Sembcorp Industries. Moderating this panel is Mr. Luca Tonello, Managing Director, Structured Finance Department, Asia Pacific, SMBC. To pose a question to our speakers, please submit them through Pigeonhole or raise your hand. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Tonello.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I believe so. Well, it's great to be back at the SIEW event, and I congratulate SIEW again for reaching the 15 years, but also for the commitment that SIEW and EMA have put into making Singapore an energy hub, and also relook at the role of Singapore as an energy hub, and not just acting in a very maybe traditional way. So Singapore has been very, very dynamic in creating a new landscape. So what for us, from what I do, I think Singapore is our center of excellence, and over the years we change a lot the focus from maybe traditional businesses into everything we do now as either sustainable component or a new technology component. And so I think what we heard today, I saw some of the presentation earlier that don't just talk about maybe renewable or hydrogen, which are the most common thing, but also other aspects of this transition that I think presents a lot of opportunity for us. But so what I would like to do, and I think we also have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions both here and online, but I will maybe kick off with the team and Vikram. So basically, from your perspective, one of the aspects before we reach our goals in 2040 to 2050 is also how do we deal with the transition, right? So for you, what do you think are the top 3 gating items to enable a smooth transition? Because that is an important part of achieving our goal. Over to you. Maybe Vikram first, yeah.
Thanks, Luca. So as many of the presenters already shared earlier, the desire for a low carbon future is generally a universal one. Most corporates, governments have some form of a net zero low carbon target by 2030, 2040, some more ambitious than others. But the last year or so has brought into play a very important aspect of the energy transition. There is a cost to be paid. There have been certain global trends that have affected the energy transition, and some may say have arisen from the energy transition. The last few years have seen an underinvestment in oil and gas production. We've had difficulties financing fossil fuel-based generation, even in developing markets, and the growth of renewables hasn't kept pace with the demand increase, which in many markets has already exceeded pre-COVID levels. So the confluence of all these factors has elevated energy prices, electricity prices in many markets, including Singapore. And electricity is a basic good. It's similar to food or water. We can't live without it. Businesses can't operate without it. So we need to be able to offer mechanisms to reduce the price volatility, and that requires governments, private sector to work together to create solutions. We need to be able to chart not just a cleaner future, but an affordable future. And if you don't get businesses and public on board, this transition, as you put it, is not going to be a smooth one.
Tim, over to you. What are your thoughts on this?
So I feel that there's a few things that we need to focus on when we think about the response to today's crisis. One of them is we have to watch very closely the cost of capital, because I think that's a really crucial indicator for many of the investments that are going to be needed. The business of creating a new energy system requires investment in a number of quite capital-intensive technologies. So I think governments have to be very focused on ways in which they can reduce those risks and bring down some of the associated costs. A second point, especially at a time of higher prices for fuels and indeed for electricity, we need to work out ways to protect consumers. And there I come back to something which I probably didn't emphasize enough in the presentation, and that's energy efficiency. It can be such an important tool to insulate consumers from the effects of high prices. And we're working very closely with countries across Southeast Asia on things like minimum energy performance standards for cooling. And I think there's a lot in there that can help.
I think we lost you in our audio, so If we cannot have you back, maybe we'll pause you there and ask.
But they also,
Teams back.
they also have they also made a big, the 1970s were a period of huge innovation. And I think that's what we need to see again today in order to resolve some of our energy challenges.
Okay, Tim. I think a couple of points I picked up here is obviously the consumer part, the cost of capital, and the energy efficiency. I think you were lost for 10 seconds, so I hope we didn't miss more. But I think on the capital side, one of the challenges we always face in this part of in this economic zone is that the opportunity is very large, but sometimes we cannot capture those opportunities fast enough. So maybe for Tim and Binu, what do you think are really the best initiatives that you see around to push the agenda in terms of both transition and net zero commitment? So in terms of what do you see working? I mean, not necessarily perhaps here, but everywhere, but of course Asia would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in terms of the cost and effects of increases, I think let's not confuse what's happening in the last few months with the overall trend. There's been a significant increase as the global economy tries to come back to a normal, that there's been some significant increases in terms of commodities, and that's also affecting the energy market. So I think it's important to take a longer term perspective. And the longer term trend is very clear that we are going towards a decrease in renewable electricity, renewable energy prices, but also storage and various other things. So that is very clear. Now, in terms of the finance, there are two aspects. One, I think was alluded to by Tim, is the role of private sector finance. And it's important that private sector finance need to play a much more bigger role in this region and elsewhere in that energy transition. And there are a number of policy signals, policy instruments that have worked. And that is important, not just in the renewable power, where I think the private sector has ramped up their investment, but also in the grid infrastructure on the supply side and the demand side in terms of storage. How do you get private sector, including individual households, and also on the supply side at the utility level, storage to be ramped up, etc. What are the mechanisms to be able to do that? And finally, the tricky issue around how do you finance the phase down or phase out of existing coal or other renewable energy power plants. And here again, I don't have an example from this region, but something that we are working with is with South Africa, which is the Just Energy Transition Platform. So South Africa, as some of you might know, is a country which is very much reliant on its coal regions, which export coal to other parts of the world, but also their generation is significantly based on coal. And what South Africa has negotiated with the international community led by Europe and the US and others is a JET platform where a financial transfer of about 8.5 billion will be made to South Africa. And starting with this September, where they shut down the first coal power plant, the Komati, is where, so what they're doing is very interesting in a sense that with these external finances, they're building a transition. One is repurposing coal power plants where they will put in place solar plus energy storage, but also create a manufacturing ecosystem where people who were supported by the previous coal power plant will be re-employed. There will be enterprises created, but also the whole just energy transition aspect of developing the skill sets required for that. So I think some of the countries which are particularly developing countries where fossil fuel currently is the major power supply source, they may need external financing. And some countries in some parts of the world has also raised this aspect. So I think there will need to be some of an external financing required for phase down and phase out of coal and other fossil fuels. But again, what is very important is that that transition is not just driven by the public sector, but it's led probably by the private sector, maybe in a PPP manner or so. So and of course, as I said earlier, the timeframes are long term, and it's not confused by the short term signals that we are seeing in terms of energy security or price points. So that's really what I would.
So this South African initiative is already a combination of private sector and public sector investment, or is mainly government driven?
Yeah, from what it's being, the first one is being decommissioned in September. There are two more which have been earmarked for decommissioning. So the sense that we get, and IRENA will also play a role as a member state in South Africa, but the enterprises which will be, for example, developing containerized mini-grid solutions for Southern Africa will be private sector. And those are going to be small, micro and medium enterprises. So providing local jobs, etc. So that'll be the private sector part. In terms of the operation of the solar larger mini-grid, maybe the South African utility will be. But by and large, I think it's going to be a PPP structure in South Africa. And other countries, again, it depends on the private sector ecosystem in the countries that you're considering, and where the conditions are right, and wherever possible, we would encourage that to be driven by the private sector with, let's say, a role for the public sector.
Yeah, thank you. So before maybe I go back to Vikram and Samuel to talk about technology. Tim, from your perspective, did you see any interesting idea, solution, both on the technology side or the capital side that you want to share?
So I think in terms of bringing utility scale renewables into the system, I mean, it's not a secret the sort of things that can help. I mean, of course, there are economy-wide risks that may need to be addressed, but you know, where countries have been successful, and I think Vietnam in many ways is a good example, you know, they offered a visibility on the remuneration available to projects. There were efforts to ensure that permitting was suitably streamlined. And I think another thing we have to have in mind, at least for utility scale renewable investments on the generation side, is that crucial importance of complementary investments on the grid. When I think about also the efficiency elements that we mentioned, it's extremely important to have that vision of how the region as a whole, in a sort of coordinated way, can move forward. And that's something that we've been trying to work on together with the ASEAN Secretariat and the ASEAN Center for Energy, putting together some roadmaps for energy efficient buildings, for energy efficient space cooling, and that give a sense of what needs to be done in the short, medium and longer term on the policy and the regulatory side for that. And I think a final point, I certainly echo the points made by Bino on the coal phase out. That's extremely important. There are some interesting initiatives also in Southeast Asia. There is this energy transition mechanism, which has been proposed by the ADB, which looks at how you can innovate on the financing side and refinance some assets in order to accelerate the retirement of coal-fired generation. All the while, though, building up the cleaner sources of generation.
Thank you, Tim. So maybe since we mentioned technology, I think it was your presentation, Bino, also you show that the impact on the CO2 reduction comes a lot from efficiency and electrification, right, which is quite. So maybe Samuel and Vikram, it would be good to induce you to talk about technology aspects, because frankly, we all have commitment that we made, but sometimes I think the clear path in terms of the technology available is not always well defined. So it'd be good to hear from your perspective what.
Yes, thank you for the question, and probably to give you a global view before going into details. The first thing when we are speaking about energy transition, we need to think big. The figures we are speaking about are massive. It took us basically 150 years to reach 60% of electrification worldwide. And we need basically right now to switch to a new economy in 20-25 years. When I say to think big, it means that we need, when we speak about technology, we need to think in terms of available technologies and technologies ready to be scaled up. The future, when we are speaking about hydrogen, when we are speaking about batteries, when we are speaking about transmission, will be around technologies we are able to produce with large quantities, and also technologies which will be affordable. Because at the end, Everything needs to fit with a business case. The second point, and I would like to come back to the first lecture, we should also have in mind that the digital topic will also be key. Technology is the mechanical part, the windmills, the PV farms. These are things where the technology today is available, it's mature. But the digital part, this is a revolution we have in front of us. We are currently living in a world of full uncertainty, and this is new. If we had had this discussion in January, maybe I would have spoken differently. But right now, when it comes to digital, it comes to sovereignty, it comes to protection, to be sure that our grids, the equipments where we will rely on, will be safe on the long run. And for this, we need to develop technologies, digital tools, enabling us to protect all the generation we will have in our hands when this grid, this technology will be available.
And digital, you referred to mainly security or also efficiency? So
and this is both. Security is first, definitely. I mean, right now, I mean, when we are speaking about European countries, the access to energy is the first topic, definitely. But also, exactly as you mentioned, the energy efficiency will be more and more a topic. Why? Because the supply chain, the scaling up approach will have its limit. So we will be, and we will have to be efficient. Which brings basically us to the third point, which also I believe is absolutely key when we speak about technology scaling up. I was really impressed again by the figures which were shared just before, when we see basically that the production of CO2 will increase at least until 2040. And we know, all of us in this round, that there is an urgency. This brings also something we have not discussed in this round, the carbon capture topic. Carbon capture will be a necessity, at least in this region. Why? Because we will go on producing carbon. And to have a carbon capture available, we need a carbon market, which is also something where we need to innovate in the region. In Singapore, there is something extremely strong already in place with a vision. There is also a beginning of carbon market in Korea, in Indonesia. They did last week the first steps. So it's beginning, but we need again to think big. A carbon market means money available to invest in carbon capture. It means also that we will be able to put on the market the technology we need to be successful in getting this 1.5 degrees achievement.
Thank you, Simon. Vikram, from your perspective, obviously not just Singapore. I mean, you are also, to a certain extent, also operating in many other markets. But what are you busy with in terms of this new effort?
So I think when you look at technologies, clearly the market is quite important. What is the affordability of the market? What are the applications for the technology? What are you trying to reduce your carbon on? Is it in the power sector? Is it in the transport sector? So if you look at this region or Singapore in particular, I'm pretty excited about the potential for both hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration. And I think it also, I'm just jumping the gun, but there's also a question about it that came out through the audience as well on hydrogen in Singapore. So if you look at a country like Singapore with a very limited natural resource for renewables, hydrogen really unlocks the potential for us to import low carbon energy from other markets to Singapore. And this is in places which have a much greater potential for renewable energy. Take Middle East and Australia, with much better solar irradiance, higher availability of land. The hydrogen can also be blended into your regular gas turbines, which is the mainstay of many markets, including Singapore, supplied on a 24/7 basis. So you address some of the increasing problems around intermittency, around grid inertia. So there's a lot going for it, but clearly we need improvements around the carrier technology, the efficiency loss around the supply chain. But hydrogen clearly has the potential to be for renewables what LNG was for natural gas. So clearly it is an important part of Singapore's energy transition in this region. The other one is carbon capture and sequestration. And if you look at Singapore, And specifically, if you look at Jurong Island, which is the petrochemical hub of Singapore, clearly that's a perfect example for where high carbon capture and sequestration could be possible. It is a significant amount of moderately concentrated CO2 in a small, dense area, surrounded in a region of producing as well as depleted oil and gas fields. There is already clarity from the Singapore government around what the carbon tax forecast is going to be, at least out for the next decade. So from a Singapore perspective, carbon capture and sequestration is probably more a matter of when rather than if it's going to happen.
Actually, on the technology, and since we have the question about hydrogen, and I know a lot of us are talking about hydrogen now almost on a daily basis, so might as well stick on the hydrogen topic. Maybe 2 points there. Obviously, Singapore, even from the Singapore's perspective, since we are in Singapore, but generally Asia, hydrogen, after all, is a gas that gets obviously liquefied. So there are other gas that has been liquefied and traded in the Asian region quite successfully. So there is an infrastructure, there is the ammonia value chain. So I also hear clearly gas turbine that can be switched. So it could even make sense to invest in gas generation with the dual fuel capacity. And then there is the point of cost. And so all these things together, and blue and green, what is your view? I think it's for all of you, and maybe on this topic also invite the audience here in the room to think any question about. I leave everyone to talk about this part, because I think the economic cost competitiveness, as we see with renewable, is key, right, for the acceleration of this technology. Please.
Yes, to give you maybe to start with some figures. If you take a 400 megawatt combined cycle power plant, which is, let's say, the standard power plants we find worldwide, and you want to fit this combined cycle power plant with hydrogen, very simple in terms of figures. You need every hour 25 swimming pools of hydrogen, 25 bars, 25 meter large, 25 meter long, 25 meter high. It gives you an idea of the volume we need to feed very traditional combined cycle power plant. If we do this example, if we apply it in my country, in France, for example, it would mean that to feed this power plant, we would need the entire hydrogen capacity of the country. So when we speak about hydrogen, we speak about a complete new business model. We speak about massive green investments in countries like Saudi, Australia, United States to be able to produce this hydrogen. We are speaking about a complete new supply chain to transport, to ship it. So the question is, when do we need hydrogen? And here, again, in the presentation just before, it was super interesting in a way that you explained that first step is electrification. When we can electrify, why should we run for hydrogen? So in the ASEAN countries, where we have a multiple of countries which are not so far away, each of them, HVDCs, interconnectors, may be the solution number one. Let's put beside the sovereignty topic. But when you are in Japan, far away from everybody, where it's not possible to bring a cable, let's say, between the continent and the island, what can you do? You import LNG, but on the long run, there is no alternative to hydrogen. And then we need to invent the supply chain. And to be cheap and affordable, we are speaking about massive investment to scale up, hundreds of gigawatts.
Without maybe put you on the spot, but that's part of my job. What is are you saying that basically the investment are so large that therefore the horizon for it to be competitive may be very far away, or we are not seeing really a scenario where we can predict when it's going to be competitive enough?
We know already, I mean, when it is competitive, we have already some business case. We have one in Australia, we have another one in Chile. We know how to proceed. The technology is there. And right now, it's a question, it's a bit like chicken and eggs. How do we start and when do we start? we discuss with many countries, and we are still at the demo case step. So we are speaking about, let's try hydrogen for 15, 20, 50 megawatt. At this step, you cannot be cost effective. When you start to think about hundreds of megawatt, it works. Thank you. You wanted to intervene.
Yeah, and I agree in terms of hydrogen. There's a sort of a hope that hydrogen will solve all the energy transition problems, and that's a bit misplaced. Hydrogen will be relevant in hard-to-abate sectors. It's not something which is an alternative to electrification. And again, competitiveness of hydrogen is relative to electrification and the cost of electrical storage, and not just hydrogen in itself. So it makes sense in your Japanese example for navigation, aviation, and also some industries like cement, steel, etc. But again, households using hydrogen for decarbonization, etc. So those are a bit more complicated. So hydrogen is likely to be used locally, and whereas what we see is Europe, where there is a legal obligation to achieve net zero by 2050 and 55% reductions by 2030. There, the European Union sees a major role for hydrogen, and this is really where, as I may have mentioned earlier, the discussions are with the nearby regions, the Middle East and North Africa, in terms of how they can supply this hydrogen. And again, the European Union standards about the color of hydrogen, etc., are much more stricter. So again, the point is, and again, what role hydrogen will have in the energy transition will be driven by political decision making. Technologies do exist, but again, the cost competitiveness is going to be relative to the cost of electrical storage. So the clear option is electrification, and where electrification plus storage, not just the electrical storage, but also there are other technologies around dynamic line rating, etc., and the electrical grid. So if they are not viable, then hydrogen comes as an option. But again, hydrogen is likely to be produced in the region or in the country rather than exported across continents. That's the sense that we get. But again, it's an uncertain area, and we see an immediate opportunity in Europe and the regions around Europe. Other regions, let's think that through, develop roadmaps, and then have policy decisions made to take forward this energy. So hydrogen, yes, but with a bit of a caution.
So the policy part is mainly driven to, or design, necessary for facilitating the investment to bring down the cost, or you see also other constraints like, I don't know, mobility of energy, or
it's better for the policy to be technology neutral. So sometimes when you make policy makers choose specific technologies and then identify targets in terms of technology, so that could be, particularly where the cost curves are evolving, that could be a bit challenging. So if energy transition policies can be technology neutral, you do have electrical units or emission reduction units, which could drive that. But then let the private sector and the ecosystem identify the right technology at the right point of time. That may be a better approach. But again, in reality, countries will need to make some choices. And this is really where we would encourage countries to be a bit more careful. And also, I think, as Tim alluded to or so, it would make sense to take a regional policy, like the European Union is doing, rather than country-by-country policy. That could also be.
Thank you. And Tim and Vikram, maybe, do you agree with this view? And anything to add or agree or not with these statements?
I fully echo the sentiments, and I don't think hydrogen is something that is going to be widely adopted anytime in the near future. I think it's going to be very market specific, and it really depends on the options that a country has. So if the certain markets can potentially afford to pay the price for hydrogen, they may lack sufficient alternatives to renewable energy. And I also take the point that power imports in certain region where you have HV AC cables could be possible, but that also involves another challenge, which is aligning different governments together, because it's never a decision of one country to be able to pull off a project like that, but many countries coming together to have a certain amount of alignment.
Tim, from you?
Yeah, maybe just to add that, I mean, every country has the potential to produce hydrogen, but production costs vary, and that creates some incentives for trade. If you look at the way this plays out in our own scenarios, it's really Northeast Asia that then is the anchor for the start of trade in hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels for the reasons that have been mentioned already. But one thing to watch out for, and there's an announcement coming today from the European Commission on their new Repower EU, the details of that plan to move away from Russian imported gas or imported fossil fuels. And that is likely to give a boost also to the European plans in this area, and perhaps also then accelerate some of the changes that you might see on the international traded side as well. But I don't think we're going to see very, very rapid changes in this sector. This is the decade of innovation, of trying to bring costs down rather than seeing a massive scale up of this.
Thank you. So you wanted to add something?
Yes, basically regarding your comment, and here we speak a lot about countries, but we need also between us to be super clear. We will not be able to make it alone. If I remember, I mean, in Europe, when we come back to the genesis of the European community, in the 50s, the topic was basically between just after World War II to commit and to work together around the coal industry. And the first decisions made in Europe were around joint purchasing together coal. Here in the region and globally in Asia Pacific, the collaboration between countries when it comes to energy is, I would say, comparing to Europe, pretty limited. When we take this information and we compare it to the volume of investments we have in front of us, to the topic of electrification and interconnections, to the carbon capture topic, because why should I do carbon capture in Singapore when on the other side of the Straits of Malacca they are not doing the same? All these kind of things will need probably a stronger collaboration between countries. And again, there will be more and more a sense of urgency. We're still here in a kind of comfort zone, but the urgency will grow up when we will feel the impact on our daily lives. And then probably we will, let's say, speed up on all these topics where we still are looking for a business model.
Thank you. We actually have one question from the online audience around the specific opportunities for Singapore in that perspective, if anybody wants to comment on that. And then while we wait for an answer on this question, again, I would like the audience here to think of some questions after this. So again, Singapore opportunities and challenges in the hydrogen space. No particular order.
No, so I think Singapore is clearly one of the markets where hydrogen is possible. Largely about 90% of the electricity now is fired by gas-fired generation. And so bringing in green hydrogen could very well easily blend into the existing energy landscape. From a price perspective, Singapore has already given guidance on the carbon taxes that will be applicable here. And it's probably one of the highest levels in Asia. And so there's clarity on it for the next decade. So I would say the potential for hydrogen in Singapore, probably, especially for hydrogen to power in Singapore, could potentially be higher than many other markets globally. I think the jury is still out there. How should such hydrogen be brought into Singapore? There are many carriers that are still out there. Liquid organic hydrides, ammonia, liquid hydrogen, maybe a couple of decades from now. So there are many technology choices that we still need to make, but the potential for bringing hydrogen to Singapore, specifically for power generation, is there.
Just before I wanted to make that point, there's also a recent publication from IRENA looking at hydrogen carriers, and obviously for short distances, existing pipelines, but beyond that, ammonia and shipping are the options. But again, these numbers are evolving. What I, am least qualified on this panel to speak about Singapore, but the general point I'd like to make is about the importance of regional interconnections of electricity grids. And that's something we are very happy to see in the Singapore net zero plan. Access to a regional electricity system will make significant contributions to the net zero planning. But also a word of caution that when we look at other regions where there is regional interconnection, like Central America or West Africa, Southern African Power Pool, etc., there is a need for a supranational institution which can regulate that market. And obviously, so the existence of an institution which has got a regional mandate is important for regional interconnections. And again, you see that happening successfully in Europe, but Europe is a common market and a monetary union in some sense. So I think when having regional interconnection as a technical option is good, but again, it needs to be based on a institutional mechanism and probably a common market. We see this happening in Africa. Africa is creating a single electricity market, and REAP is, IRENA is providing this modeling tool for the Continental Master Plan, and it is driven by the African Union Commission. So there is a blueprint which is emerging, but please don't ignore the institutional aspect and the political underpinnings with the regional electricity market. Technology alone will not solve it.
Actually, on this point, and I mean, having been here quite some time and discussed energy and infrastructure investment, that topic of the interconnectivity, common regulation, etc. So Singapore is already a hub in many areas. Of course, capital flow to a lot extent, and also been the hub for innovation, etc. On the hydrogen value chain, but also perhaps broader, transition technology, carbon capture, renewables. Where do you see what could be the best angle for Singapore, right, in positioning itself in this region, globally per se, right? One of the points that we were always discussed within our team is we always think about the investment, the capital investment part. And one thing that is happening in the new sort of transition phase is obviously energy or the technology are very distributed. So the capital value, if you like, is smaller, and sometimes it's even intangible, right? So how can we capture this, or where do you see potentially a successful angle for Singapore in maybe not just hydrogen, but hydrogen and the other prevailing technology that we see in front of us?
Maybe, and here, I take it, I mean, as a company, I take it with a lot of humility. When you read at the Singaporean energy roadmap, you are impressed. You are impressed. Because in Singapore, and this is not comparable so far to what other countries in the region and worldwide are doing, it's crystal clear about what they want to achieve within the next years. And hydrogen is part of a global strategy, including interconnections, including different kind of technologies. So to come back to the beginning of your question, for what we see in my company, we believe that Singapore will be more and more a hub when it comes to developing new technologies. It's one of the only places on earth where we invest so massively in R&D and innovation. We have here in this ecosystem everything to tackle the problem, including the carbon capture you was just mentioning. And as you mentioned also, Singapore is and will be probably more and more during the time around the energy technology, the hub to develop and to expand this technology around. When you discuss in Australia, in Vietnam, and you were mentioning Thailand, even in Korea, you continuously have Singaporean companies looking at solutions to invest and to be part of the energy story. So more than a hub, I see this country as a place to be part and to get the most of the knowledge of the people to leverage. Thank you.
We thank you for the questions, and I think the good thing about this debate is that it's very open. And again, I want to thank you, the panelists, and of course, EMA for hosting us again. It's great to be back, and looking forward to the event in October. I personally was not expecting the launch itself to be so exciting and so dense with topics, so I think I really enjoyed the afternoon, and thank you for participating, and thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers for the lively and engaging discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of today's program. On behalf of the Energy Market Authority, I would like to thank you for joining us at the SIEW 2022 Global Launch. A recording of today's event and the presentation slides will be made available on our website at www.siew.gov.sg. Please also share your feedback with us by scanning the QR code displayed on the screen. We will welcome everyone to join us at SIEW 2022, happening from 25th to 28th October, for discussions on a resilient and sustainable energy future. Thank you.